Welcome to Make Me Data Literate, the podcast that makes data intelligible from the Australian Data Science Education Institute. We're on a mission to make the whole world data literate. I'm your host, Dr. Linda McIver, and every week I'll interview someone with a wild and wonderful relationship to data. Let's see what we can find out. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Make Me Data Literate. I'm super excited today to have another opportunity to indulge the chance to interview amazing and fascinating people. And today we have Ellen Broad. Welcome, Ellen. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we start, can you introduce yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
Sure. So, I'm an associate professor at the School of Cybernetics here at the Australian National University. Cybernetics is a word that most people haven't encountered unless they are really passionate about either the history of computing or were kind of early users of the web, of kind of early computing infrastructure, networked infrastructure. But for a lot of people, it's an unknown term. What that means I do day to day is like cybernetics is all about systems and thinking about how systems interact with technical, human, and environmental dynamics and processes that say something about the way a system works. So, in my day to day work, I quite often am looking at, what are the dynamics and relationships between a computing system that's embedded in a real world context that is very messy, changing all the time, and what can those forces changing tell us about how we redesign that computational system. So just lots of like everything is messy. How do we start to anticipate and design for mess instead of trying to make things neater, and presume everything is predictable? So that's kind of my day to day kind of questioning and thinking. I do some teaching at the School of Cybernetics. I oversee some research projects, and my background is primarily in kind of responsible data, data ethics, large real world data implementation projects. And yeah, that's about it. Obviously, I have a life outside of data and computing. So I like board games. I've written a book. I spend a lot of time staring lovingly at mid-century architecture that I can't afford.
For background, the book that Ellen referred to, uh, what's the word? Demurely there was is called Made by Humans, and you absolutely need to read it if you haven't, because it's amazing. And that's how I first came to be aware of Ellen as a someone really important in the data space. I love that idea of cybernetics as connecting systems with um, the real situations they're embedded in. I feel like as a tech industry, we have a tendency to develop systems in isolation and in sort of nice, clean little labs, and then throw them out into the world and go, oh, real things happen there that we didn't anticipate. And whoa, how could we have seen that coming?
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes I'll talk to people and they'll say, what you're describing already exists. It's user experience design, or it's human computer interaction, or it's anthropology. But actually, cybernetics takes as its focus and its kind of point of study and intervention the intersections between elements of a system and what events are occurring at those intersections and like what they tell you about the system that you're trying to understand. So it's actually, um, you know, a lot of the ways that we've added to our understanding of technical products, because as you say, we're like, we just design them and then we put them into the world. We actually still have what I'd call both a linear approach to design and deployment of a technical product. And typically, once it's in the world, we move on to designing the next thing. And we don't actually have, because computing is still very young, a sophisticated set of practices that allow us to design products such that they are easy to change as the dynamic contexts in which they sit change. Because, like, change happens, like,
Yeah.
that is a given, but actually, we have not factored that into our engineering practices other than to say, well, this is when you just upgrade to a wholly new product. Like, and so we have so many problems stemming from the fact that we still do typically take an approach to the design of technical products, which is we just build them and then we put them in the world. And then when they're no longer suitable for purpose, we'll design a new one without thinking about the relationships between that broader world and the things that we're designing.
Yeah, it's definitely a pervasive issue, and I think perhaps not just in the tech industry, but very um, severely in the tech industry. You've had a really varied career. I was just kind of truffling through your bio before this interview, and it's like, oh man, you have been everywhere and done everything, and you're like so young. Um, what did you have to learn? Like, what was missing from your formal education? What did you have to kind of go find out and figure out to do what you do?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because for anyone listening, Linda sent me this question in advance, and I realized I've never really been asked this question before or had to think about it. And the first thing that now I think about is the fact that, so my undergraduate degrees were in law and arts, but I also did my degrees in Western Australia, in Perth. And it perhaps only became apparent to me during the pandemic how much of my upbringing and the environment that I did my formal studies in had its own economy. And like it, so when I was completing my formal education at the University of Western Australia, in Western Australia, you would never look somewhere else to study. Like, there are five universities in Perth, maybe more. Someone is going to like irately respond saying how many. But like, it wouldn't have occurred to me to like look at the East Coast for potential options, to consider pathways beyond Western Australian institutions. And when I was completing my studies, really a lot of the kind of focus of those studies was about jobs in Western Australia. And so, for example, as a law graduate, you either went into a top tier law firm, and I worked for one whilst completing my studies, or you went into oil and gas or mining, or you went into the public service. And there really wasn't, at that particular point in time, a sense that anything else existed. And really, it took me leaving Perth to realize that there were other pathways and other things that I could do. And I don't know that I can put it into words like these skills were missing in my formal education. It was more that I realized, and I think this is true of wherever you do your education, is that like the design of my education was a product of the context in which it was created. And I wasn't quite aware of that context until I left it. And so when I moved, not first to the East Coast, but then I moved to Paris and I moved to the Netherlands and London, I'd say that the skills that have always served me well in moving from job to job is not so much a particular kind of formal training, but more that like those experiences of moving a lot helped me become a more kind of curious and agile and adaptive contributor to lots of different kinds of work. So, like, quite often, something people will say to me is, oh, could you talk to my child who's just about to finish their degree to help them navigate what they want to do, or, like they don't know what job to go into. And really, I think a part of it is like, I just got a job as soon as I could graduate. But then I kind of used that as a mechanism to figure out what other thing I was interested in. And then I would try and figure out how to move there. And I feel like you could just chart my entire career in terms of like, I'm going to do this thing. because actually this tangential thing over here looks really interesting and I can't see a route to that thing directly, but I can wiggle my way there. Um, and so just kind of by doing, I guess, I've, yeah. So nothing about, like, I think it took leaving my formal education for me to realize that what I was missing was not like, God, I really wish I'd learned technology law, for
Mm,
example, because I just literally didn't exist. And like not anywhere, because this is before we really understood what it was doing.
yeah.
Um, but more that your formal training is always a reflection of the context in which it's delivered. And it part of growing as humans is trying to get outside those contexts into different places, because then they tell us something about who we are and what we've learned and kind of where we want to go.
I think that's super important, and it doesn't like it's an understanding that we don't transmit very well at schools. The careers process at schools is still very much okay, pick a career that you want to go into, now pick the course for it, and plan out your whole career, which is, it's not, it doesn't mesh with the way careers happen now, and the fact that you can wind up 5 years from graduating in a career that didn't exist when you were at school. And um, you move from one thing to the next, and suddenly a door opens in a field that you'd never considered, but that it turns out you can turn your skills to. I had a conversation some years ago with a Nobel Prize winner, Wolfgang Ketterle, and he said that he had made his Nobel Prize winning discovery only a year or two into a new field. And he said that it was the fact that it was a new field that enabled him to make the discovery, because he was bringing all of the knowledge and skills from the previous field to the new field and applying them in new ways. So he came with a fresh perspective, which I think was clear in Made by Humans, that you had, this wasn't someone who'd been in the tech industry from birth and was kind of immersed in it. You were giving, you brought this, you understood it really well, but you brought this fresh perspective of, hang on a minute, perhaps let's not drink the Kool-Aid. let's, let's look at this from a human perspective.
It's really lovely to hear you say that, because I feel like I spent, so I'm now I think 12 or 13 years out of finishing my formal training, and I feel like I spent the first possibly 8 to 10 years trying to pretend I didn't have a non-technical background. Like, I was doing a master's in computer science. I was embedded in engineering teams. And if anyone said, like, oh, like Ellen with a legal degree, I
Mm.
would like try and squash it and prove that I had the other knowledge and skills, which I do. But like, I could feel myself really trying to reject that part of me that had a kind of law and arts background, because it meant that I didn't fit in. But definitely the older that I'm getting and the more experience that I have, I've realized that, as you've pointed out, it like gives me a perspective and a set of skills to bring to challenges that kind of are new, and not as a critical lawyer who's sitting there saying, think of all of the things that could go wrong here. Like, I still work in an engineering context, and I still work in a school whose job it is to design technologies more responsibly to build a better world. It's not to be critical thinkers or to build frameworks to regulate technologies, but nonetheless, I have skills to bring all of that together. Um, and so, yeah, it's only recently that I've started to kind of like welcome and embrace those parts of my educational background that I think I did spend a really long time like genuinely getting offended if anyone in an engineering context brought up like, Ellen, she has a legal degree, because it would make me feel like an outsider.
Yeah, and especially as a woman in tech, you have to constantly reinforce and kind of slam your credentials on the table.
Yeah. Yeah,
Just
even if they're not relevant. Like, sometimes I would be in contexts where they would be, looking for a certain a background that was like their own. Like, did you build your own computers in high school? Because if you didn't, you're not technical. And I'm like, we're doing data standards. Like,
Yeah.
whether I spent a lot of time building personal computers in high school has very little direct bearing on designing APIs to facilitate transmission of sensitive personal data.
Yeah.
Like, I can see that that reflects your cultural background, but in terms of skills to bring to the task at hand, they're not a legitimate basis on which
Yeah.
to determine one's fit for a project or not.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
absolutely right. And that kind of gatekeeping frustrates me particularly because some kids, and especially kids who are not, uh, not the standard sort of type of person we expect to see in tech, those kids don't get those opportunities. They don't have, and the kids who don't have the funding to build their own
Yeah.
computers, and the kids who just never had that opportunity, never had that exposure.
And
It
I
really
really
slams the door on anyone who's not sort of, you know
Uh, and I love your like, there was a real crystallizing moment in your book for me, Raising Heretics, where you talked about one of the failures in kind of like STEM education in primary and secondary schooling being to um, prioritize like building cool stuff
Yeah.
or lights or robots and not solving real world problems, because when you prioritize the like whizzy gadgets or the can you build a computer in your home,
Mm,
you actually do get a much smaller subset of people identifying with the area than those who passionately care about solving real world problems. And I saw myself in that. I was like, I passionately care about technology and I passionately care about building technology. And I'm actually very interested in all of the skills associated with that. I went back to do programming, I went back to do database design, statistics, not because I enjoy doing those things for their own sake. Statistics is terrible and I hate it. But I
I'm so relieved to hear
for
you say that.
And actually, what was really lovely about my experience doing statistics was it also, again, another point that you make in your book about like the way we measure success or measure suitability was when I started tweeting about my experience doing statistics. All of these incredible technical people were like, "I nearly failed statistics. Statistics is really hard. This is like
Mm,
the work. Like it is not like normal maths. Like you know." They just like to realize that I was embarking on something that just genuinely was tough for lots of people and not meant that I was a failure. But like I was interested in those skills because of the bigger problems that they helped me solve. And so, um, I quote and talk about that section of your book in lots of contexts now because um, I actually think that failure, where you see really fantastic kind of cross disciplinary collaborations, is not where people say, well, I have a certain set of skills. Like, we need a data scientist, and we need a software engineer, and we need an anthropologist. But where they have a language to articulate the common problems that they care about.
mm.
And we don't necessarily approach STEM education that way.
Yeah, and I think, when we focus on the toys and the tech and the, soldering irons and things, we are selecting for all the kids we've already got.
Totally. And,
Absolutely
I
burning
have
out.
I have a girl and a boy, like, and one thing that's just been so surprising to me, like, despite being really well educated and a staunch feminist and really keen to support my children having careers in STEM, is just how young um, the kind of pre-selection for certain kinds of toys is,
Mm,
even where they think they're being gender neutral. Like I vividly recall my 2-year-old daughter's birthday party where she'd just been to her friend's birthday party the week before, and he got like giant trucks and like um, garages and complicated bits of machinery that lit up and her eyes just being on stalks because they were all of her favorite things. And then
Mhm.
when it was her birthday the following week, people knew not to give her girly things because I'd be standing there like a thunderclap. Like, but also people didn't want to buy her like boy things. So instead she would get like animals and
Oh,
blocks and you could just like I could see her processing the like, yeah, these are cool toys, but like these are not as cool as like those giant dump truck that
mm,
my friend got last week. And then already by her third birthday, she's hyper aware of the fact that some toys are for boys and some toys are for girls. And she just won't now take like I could have given her a dump truck on her second. I mean, like we gave her trucks on her second birthday, but it's so young that it starts the sense of like these things are for me and these things are not for me. Because now our issue is she'll get given something that's clearly like branded for boys and she
yeah,
doesn't want it. She'll be like,
yeah,
and I think we're really good now at kind of finding a gender neutral middle. Like, let's get the kid a t shirt with a palm tree on it because that's not boy or girl,
yeah,
and not yet like dinosaurs are for everyone, pink is for everyone. Um, and it's really hard. So, I can already see how different my 1 and 3 year olds' pathways are going to be through schooling in ways that I can't affect and don't want to. Like, I don't want to buy my daughter all boy themed stuff in a like, she clearly doesn't want it and it
yeah,
agitates her.
yeah,
Um, she just wants because her girlfriends have girly things. She wants to fit in. And so, it's this real conflict as a parent to navigate, as I know you would have navigated, and all parents do. I'm like,
yeah.
please stop it. Can't
I
they
have a
just
photo of my oldest when she's 3 and she's in a tutu and playing with a dump truck, and I'm like, that's where we should be,
Yeah.
tutu and gumboots and dump trucks and whatever you want, but it's not the
No.
way it is. There was a classic scene in, I think it was in the series, No More Boys and Girls, that English series. Did you ever see
I
it?
haven't seen it.
I'll have to see if I can find it for you. They did a little experiment where they had a baby, like 9 months old, so sitting up and playing and interacting, but still kind of unformed, very rounded, very chubby baby kind of things. And they would dress the boy babies in pink and the girl babies in blue, and they would give them like a suitable name. So the girl babies would be dressed in blue and be called Oliver or something, and the boy babies would be dressed in pink and called Jane. And then they would bring strangers in to play with them, and the strangers would hand them toys according to the gender they presented as, and say, he was just more interested in the trucks, even though he was actually Olivia. And
Hmm.
you know, so the idea that we don't bring our own preconceptions to the way we interact with babies according to how we perceive their gender is fascinating to me. Um, anyway, I'm getting sidetracked.
One point that I would make about that, to bring it back to, cybernetics, is like cybernetics would say, like, that's what your starting point would be. That, like, very few things are defined and unchanging, but they're always in relationship to something else. And second order cybernetics talks a lot about vantage point and perception as like driving the way we perceive something. That there is always values and assumptions brought to whatever it is. So, you could look at, like, if I was like trying to do a study of interactions with toys as a cyberneticist, it's like certain starting points would be a given, that like there is no predefined or controllable way to approach this, that there are forces always in relationship to each other that are having an effect. And so something that just makes me really excited about cybernetics as a kind of organizing way of seeing the world is when that is your starting point for a range of problems and disciplines, it really changes your approach to like what you think the solution is, because it is not as simple as like, we'll just have this particular intervention and that will solve the problem, because you have to go, well, if I intervene this way, this is there will be an effect. What might those effects be? So anyway, I just yeah.
And that, that ties in with the idea that we actually have to stop and evaluate what we've done and see what impact it had, which is not something, it's something I build into all of my projects, that if kids try to solve a problem, then they have to analyze it again to see if it worked, and to see where it didn't work and to see how it could be improved, because there's no such thing as a perfect solution. But imagine if we did that, by default in government and in business and in education. You actually stop to say, well, did it work? And how well did it work? And where did it fall down? Because we don't, we seem to miss that step. And as a scientist, I find that intolerable. It's like you can't change something and then not stop and look at what impact that had. But well, apparently you can. Um, You've done a
Mhm.
lot of work in data ethics and fairness, and sort of managing data in rational and positive ways. Is there one thing that you wish everyone knew about data?
Oh, choose one thing.
Choose five.
What,
That
like,
might
I
be good
think what I'm about to say is a double-edged sword, because I'm now experiencing the effects of this being my one thing. Is like, one thing, like, no data set is perfect. Like, there is no such thing as a data set that has captured everything that you want to know about the situation you're trying to make sense of. Like, whether we're trying to understand weather observations, which we have lots of data to support, any meteorologist will immediately accept that premise. Their
Mm,
data is not perfect. There is a margin for error. They're doing the best they can. And sometimes they're going to say it'll rain and it's not going to rain. But actually, in a number of computational settings, we seem to just forget that starting point. That, like, the data that you're using to solve your problem is just not perfect for the problem you're trying to solve. Like, it never will be. So, figuring out what is missing and what you need to do is actually not a if we were being like really dot the i's and cross the t's, or like if we had more time, but actually just a necessary starting point. Um, that would be my one thing. The reason I now say I can see how that can be a double edged sword is, a big part of Made by Humans was really unpacking that concept and demonstrating that the way that we collect data as data custodians, in a range of settings, that it's informed by our own values and assumptions. It's informed by the instruments that we have with which to collect data, which all have their own histories. One of the challenges that I now encounter occasionally is people then kind of immediately flip to, so we shouldn't use this data. Or like, we
mm.
cannot trust,
Yeah.
or we cannot trust any results because the data isn't perfect.
Yeah.
And actually, there is a like mature middle that I think is slowly growing, which is that in the same way in other complex systems, we understand that um, there are good practices and there are practices that should be expected as part of responsible data management to help you know whether you can trust in the results that are being presented, and that the way those results are presented will tell you a little bit about how much you can trust them. And then there are just totally terrible, shoddy uses that we instinctively kind of recognize as such. So, yeah, I think we're slowly navigating through the like, what there's increasing acceptance that data is not perfect, and it reflects our values and it reflects historical contexts and circumstances and instruments. But then now it's like, whoa, 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 this doesn't mean we stop using data, because it's really powerful and can help us address a number of problems. That point that you were just making about, we don't seem to go back and evaluate the impact of the work that we do in a number of complex areas. We need data to do that. Like, to measure our effectiveness in reducing carbon emissions, we need to be able to measure carbon emissions using metrics that we all agree are robust. Um, and so when people are like, well, we just can't trust it, that's actually absolving us of responsibility for dealing with the effects of
Yeah.
the situations we create.
And it is that difference, isn't it, between rational and irrational skepticism. It's the we do need to be skeptical, but we need to be skeptical on the basis of evidence and data. And when I work with schools and we talk to the teachers about what's the first thing you need to ask about this data, what's the first thing the kids should ask, and for me, the answer is what's wrong with it? Like that should
Mhm.
always be step one. What is wrong with this data? Because as you say, there is no such thing as a perfect data set. And when you were saying that, I was kind of nodding so hard my head nearly came off my shoulders. I was like,
Mhm.
yes. um, but that's I think one of those indicators you talked about of, is this a decent analysis and is this data being handled responsibly, is does the analysis come with here are the flaws, here are the issues with the data set, here are the issues with my analysis. Given that, we can still be pretty confident that this is the outcome we're looking at. And I used to talk to the students when I was teaching science. There is no such thing as a perfectly accurate measurement. The question is it accurate enough?
Yeah.
And so with the data, is it good enough for the purposes you're using it for? And if it's not, how can you compensate for that and build that awareness into what you do with the data?
And something that, you know, like, it is very new that in computing we have huge quantities of data and the computing power available with which to analyze them rapidly and predict certain outcomes, whether that's good or not. Like, it's very new that that is even it's like 25 years old, which is crazy in terms of how new it is, in contrast with, the profession of statistics, which goes back now a couple of centuries at least. And some would trace it all the way back to like the Domesday Book in the, what is it, 10th or 11th century. Again, you're going to get a listener that's like, it was this year, it exists. But, we have like years and years of using information to measure certain outcomes. And the example that I quite often give, of like actually quite responsible data practice, is the statistics profession. Um, like, something that I think sometimes we fail to appreciate is, for example, in Australia, for any statistical instrument that the Australian Bureau of Statistics creates, there are like quite a robust set of processes underpinning it that they document and they publish alongside the instrument explaining like how they chose this particular indicator to measure the response to this question and what it does and doesn't include and how they came to that conclusion. And like, there is actually like very detailed documentation trying to say, like, this measures something, it does not measure everything. And that those processes, like, and that documentation is the result of a profession that has over decades been at the forefront of, particularly at the realm of like national statistics that are used to then determine policy outcomes, like know what happens when statistics are misinterpreted or miscalculated or misrepresented by the statistics profession. And there are, um, legislative penalties for statisticians if they, um, abuse the practice of statistics. Like, it is a profession using data in its day to day work that has already had to grapple with a lot of these things. Um, and so, sometimes it can feel a little bit like in computer science and machine learning, like we're reinventing the wheel. And it's like, who could have told us that this data was constrained by the circumstances of its collection? And it's like, there are, sorry, maybe you can see me just gesturing. I kind of like gestured to a blank space next to me, like,
This
you
entire
know,
field.
this
Yeah.
entire field. And it's not that they are perfect and like that they have struggled to come to terms with the rise of digital born data and how to make use of that. But it's like that, you know, we have got lessons that we can learn from other disciplines. And
I feel like that's a massive issue with the kind of siloization of disciplines, particularly in universities, but everywhere. That the computer scientists tend not to talk to the statisticians. They're separate faculties, and I was talking to a former student about why that might be yesterday, and I said, well, part of it is the funding model that. If you go and do a computer science degree, computer science wants you to do all of your units in computer science because then they get the funding for every unit that you do outside computer science is lost funding to them, and so there's this kind of you get this uh you know these walled gardens built where it's really hard to collaborate and to do cross-disciplinary stuff.
Yeah, and that's something that's really unusual about the School of Cybernetics, um, is that our educational programs really embed engineering alongside theory and history as part of the same program. And our students are kind of purposefully selected. It's a competitive selection process. They submit portfolios. They're purposefully selected in part for their diverse backgrounds. We do not want to end up in a situation where everybody coming into our program is a computer science postgraduate. We only have postgraduate programs at the moment, so everyone will come to us having something, not necessarily a university degree, but they could have spent 10 years as a practicing artist or 10 years in the press gallery, and even that we can accept students based on professional experience is itself rare in a
Mm.
university postgraduate setting, that we're prepared to admit people based on equivalent professional experience and not you have to have already done an undergraduate degree and achieved certain results, because we know people's life paths don't always start with an undergraduate degree, and that actually, particularly for some of the problems we're facing now in technology, that you have an undergraduate degree in my case, like from 12 years ago in law,
Mm.
actually doesn't really say anything about your suitability as a postgraduate student for this entirely new context that we're in, with new kinds of problems requiring different experiences to address. So at the school, we are quite deliberate in trying to craft an educational experience that does not hew to any one disciplinary approach. But the one thing that I would say about that is, in practice, like part of as well as you're right, there are like funding incentives that incentivize disciplinary silos. But it's also that, like, in practical terms, it's really easy to work with people that think the same way that you do. Like,
Yeah.
like, um, it it's hard to even articulate, but like you would have this. You would fall into certain patterns of conversation and easiness, and like, yes, we both agree on what the problems are, drawing on your computer science background, on your data background, on your education background. Like, you'd be like, I recognize my people and I can talk to them.
Yeah,
It is
absolutely.
it is actually really hard to engage with and collaborate with people who don't share your viewpoints, and like not
Mm.
only your kind of like disciplinary framing, but even kind of your sense of like where you sit in terms of, are you left leaning or right leaning. And that's something that's also really interesting about the school, is that we also try to really teach our students and our faculty, because our faculty also span many disciplines, and one of the constant, any one faculty that you ask what we need more of, they will say more of like I need more legally
Yeah.
trained, because we try and get our faculty and students comfortable with discomfort, like that part of addressing complex problems is actually developing the skills, the resilience, the familiarity, the tips, the things that help you communicate and solve problems across silos. Because that is
Mm.
what we're actually not very good at exposing people to. Um, and also, it's something that actually feels pretty uncomfortable for people when they're doing it.
Oh
And
yeah.
if I was to think of the projects in my career that after completing them, I was like, wow, they were really transformational for me. Usually at the time, they were the ones that I was going home every single night, bitching and moaning to my partner about, like, nobody understands me. This is infuriating. I'm trying to achieve something and I'm just getting blocked left, right, and center. And then it's only like afterwards that I've kind of realized how much that I've grown as a result of all of that friction and can do those kinds of projects better as a result. But they usually never feel pleasant while you're doing them.
Yep.
And that's
Yep.
like kind of half of the point.
That makes perfect sense to me. Um, what are some of the worst data mistakes you've seen? Like, and I'm not talking about deliberate misuses. We'll get to that in a minute. But just the careless errors or things where people thought they had the right answer and just didn't.
I think probably the most frustrating kind of mistake that I see made, because it's so basic, but it also unfolds your entire approach to a problem, is where people fail to understand that the information they have is a proxy for what it is that they want to measure. Like, full stop. And you see that unfold in so many types of contexts where people will say something like, I have a data set of images of people's faces, and
Mm.
I want to understand rates of criminal activity. Or I have a data set of um, uh, people's consumption of food. And I want to use that data set of people's, no, let me check. I want to use a data set of people's purchasing of food to understand nutrition habits across a population, and fail to understand, that purchases of food is purchases of food, which is a proxy that you are trying to use to measure nutrition, but actually is not a data set of what people are consuming. It is purchases. And so I think at a basic level, if I could like fix one thing or like really improve our education in one setting, it would be just like really helping people understand that, like, what is it that you are using this information as a proxy for, and what are the implications of using this data as this proxy, because there will always be implications, because as we said, like, you never have um like I used weather forecasts earlier in the program, and that's like a great example of, like, they are using past weather phenomenon as a data set to try and measure future weather phenomenon, and they are also using as inputs like weather patterns in other parts of the landscape and different ways of measuring weather patterns. And they use all of that as a proxy to measure a future thing that they do not have data on. Like, they do not have any data on, is it going to rain tomorrow? And so there is a real appreciation for, we are using all of this as a proxy for the thing that we are trying to measure. So we think there could be rain, but also, like, that is a prediction and not a prophecy. And yet I actually think in a lot of automated contexts, we just are like, oh, we can absolutely make a decision about someone's admission to university based on an automated evaluation of their results to date,
Oh,
without thinking
yeah.
about,
We
like,
could be
well,
talking about that all day.
uh, like, success at university is dependent on many things, and you are using as a proxy to measure future success in your program
Mm.
past success in a completely different context.
Yep.
So anyway, there you go. That's my one thing.
That's one of my favorite rants about education, and I often say to people, when you see a new doctor, do you ask them what they got in their final exams? No, because you don't care, because exams are not, their performance on exams is no indicator of how good they are at diagnosing complex problems and how good they are at communicating with you. And the key questions you want to ask about doctors, none of them relate to how did they do on their year 12 exams or on their
Mm.
final um, med course exams. um so that brings us to data which is deliberately misused. Have you ever seen things like that that you're prepared to talk about?
So I think, we actually are in a context at the moment where you can see the misuse of data playing out with like political consequences. So, the classic one that I think we all experienced during the pandemic was how different cities and provinces around the world chose to measure and report positive cases. And you really saw the politics of access to information playing out, where like some jurisdictions would choose not to measure
Mm.
because if you had an accurate measure of cases, you might be required to take action in response to that. You had changes to the criteria of how to measure a positive case. You had situations where jurisdictions were making it very difficult to access infrastructure that would allow you to measure successful cases. So I think actually we see just in the world around us the power afforded by accurate, high quality, and accessible data, and then all of the ways in which we try to misuse and misinterpret and like willfully um, kind of suppress or ignore um, a picture being presented by data. And you just like you see that everywhere. Like we recharacterize the point in a pregnancy at which a fetus is considered viable. Like we change our
Yep.
definition of fetus such that anything prior to that is now like you update your kind of measuring um, kind of ideology and apparatus. Um, in like I think if I'm trying to think of like kind of that's all about the ideology and like the way that we actually use data as power and we
Mm.
manipulate it to achieve certain ends. But there's lots of kind of forms of abuse of data that I think just occur um, out of like negligence and laziness and it is easier to say we've solved this problem using computing and data than it is to actually solve this problem. And, there are examples like that across the health sector, social services sector. One that was really widely reported in the United States last year was a software system that purported to triage patients in need of care based on a data set of payments associated with the provision of healthcare. And when they started to audit the results of that system that tried to automatically triage patients in terms of who needed care most urgently, because they were using a data set of payments for care, uh, what it was actually measuring were those who received care and received care
Oh no.
expediently and like more prolonged services of care. So obviously, non-white patients were receiving lower standards of care. Were
Mm.
receiving like kind of harsher types of interventions. Like you have sepsis in the leg, we'll amputate the leg because that is a faster intervention than ongoing care related to rehabilitation and triaging of sepsis. And so the triaging just exacerbated the disparities in access to healthcare. And I say that that is a form of abuse because once you are aware that that is the effect your system has, you are actually like morally culpable for the effect that that has. And those are the forms of abuse that actually drive me most insane. Where actually now we're talking like we're in negligence territory. We're like,
Yep.
we're in laziness territory. Yeah, but that problem of who gets access to care is not our problem, us providing
Mm.
the software. So we're not going to address them. Like, actually, your
Yeah.
software, your software is reflecting this situation. So you cannot be like, well, my software just like you are servicing software on the promise that you're improving triaging of healthcare needs, and you should no longer be able to say that that is what it is doing. Like, you do have
Yeah.
a responsibility there.
Because you're actually just magnifying bias.
Yeah, and like people kind of still want to push the problem onto someone else, and I'm like, but if you are in that system and you are purporting to offer a product as part of that system, just like, again, it's like cybernetics would say there is no such thing as a system apart.
Yeah.
Like, there is no way of observing and intervening in a system from outside it. You are always part of the set of actors and relationships that are shaping it. So I get cranky.
And rightly so. And the example you used initially of the COVID positive COVID cases is a classic case of proxy data, because people will say, "Oh, we had several thousand, this many thousand cases in Australia today." And I'm like, "No, we had this many thousand cases test positive. That's not how many cases we have." And we don't actually know the relationship between the number of tests positive and the number of, because we've never done any random sampling of the population, and
Yeah.
it's
Everyone already
we
jokes
forget.
around. Yeah, everyone already jokes around us now. You've probably heard it too. They're like, "Don't test, don't tell."
Yeah.
Like, if you don't test,
Yeah.
we don't know. And so, you just see increasing incentives not to test because there are flow on effects from. So, again, I know I keep being like, and cybernetics would say, but like, it's true. You would approach these problems going, whatever I do will have an effect. So, how do I
Yeah.
anticipate those effects, not prevent them, but like, what would anticipating that change about my approach now? I still have to do the thing, I still have to measure cases because we do need to. Like, the solution there is not, well, let's just stop measuring cases because we can't rely on the measures that we've got. It's like, well, like, what am I going to do about this problem?
And we don't ask that enough. We don't ask what are the implications and what are the effects going to be, and how can we mitigate those? How can we build our awareness of these effects into the way we then
Yep.
proceed? Um, so that's a bunch of ways in which data is used, misused, and abused. How do we spot things like that? Like, if we're presented with data in the media, what do you look for?
Um, what do I look for? Because data is presented in so many different ways through the media that I'm trying to think of the like. So I guess if I took as a starting point, like any media story that is making a particular line of argument based on a study that is cited, I'll just immediately go to try, like, an annoying thing about our media ecosystems is they don't like linking to third party material because that drives you away from the website. So you
Mm.
usually have to do your own work to figure out the history of statistics presented through a media story. So that's like one thing that I quite often do is if they're saying, um, like there was one just last week that was really emotive and kind of emotive for me, which was, I'm sure you saw it too, the way a particular line of research identifying the potential cause of SIDS related, like SIDS deaths, and some media stories presented as like we've solved this problem
Yes. Oh.
and like how wonderful we have solved it. And actually, when I went, because I was very excited, and then I went and read the research, and it's much more nuanced. It's,
Mhm.
we found a potential indicator,
Yeah.
we've found a potential enzyme that suggests it could be a contributing factor.
Yeah.
Further research is necessary. So I look for those kinds of things, like where a study is cited, what does it actually, like, does it say that?
Mm.
Um, and I'm particularly wary of it because I actually think in technology related stories, it's actually like usually, particularly anything involving AI or machine learning, or like machine learning can do this.
Yes.
And then you go back and read the study, and it's just like an immediate, that is definitely not possible. That is not what the study says. And if it does say it, it was a bad study.
Yeah.
So usually I just go and look at whatever the primary sources are.
Yeah. I think that's excellent advice. I mean, it's a shame we don't, as you say, have that as a default, that the primary sources are, linked and available for tracking back. I think that's really important. Do you think our understanding of data has changed over the last 2 years because of the pandemic?
I think it has at a kind of really basic conceptual level. I know, the topic of this podcast is data literacy, and data literacy can be impacted in so many ways. And I know you talk about it in Raising Heretics and talk about it in your education programs. Um, in general, I think there has both been through the pandemic an appreciation, not even necessarily explicitly, but an appreciation of um, the way information is used to make public health decisions and policy decisions, and also the kind of juncture between those that, sometimes data can tell you one thing, but it will not necessarily be the basis for a political decision because decisions are also political, like,
Mm,
and that these things are in tension. Like, I think people are aware of the role information plays in decision making, both at an individual level. We look up exposure lists, we look up
yeah.
daily cases, and we appreciate certain levels of information, but also aware of like its role in decision making. I think people are also developing a like I don't know necessarily that it's a healthy skepticism, but a skepticism about data use generally. An example that I now give quite a lot is, like it used to be that my parents just would never talk to me about my job and would never talk to anyone. Like it just wasn't a part of our conversations. But then now my dad will tell me about the conversations he has at the like fruit and vegetable market on the weekends in
Yeah.
Wanneroo in like the northern suburbs of Perth, um, about my health record or about automated debt recovery or
Mm,
about digital identity, where they're just talking now from a position of like this stuff is dodgy,
yeah.
and they are like my dad didn't finish high school, he has no background in data or computing, but it's like such a topic of conversation now and is part of kind of cultural discourse
Mm,
that you know there is data awareness growing, that it
yeah.
is complex and multifaceted, whether we are achieving base levels of data literacy of a kind that would improve our interpretation of data. Like, does everyone understand really basic statistical concepts like how to interrogate the way that we sample in order to um, analyze data, or like how is it that we understand the difference between median and mean
Mm.
and how those are calculated. I don't think we're there yet.
No, no, I completely agree. One last question before we wrap up. I've loved this conversation. What excites you about data?
Like so many things. I and I talked a little bit about this in Made by Humans. Like I really fell into this amazing, multifaceted community of people accidentally and would never have considered as like Ellen Broad university undergraduate doing law, majoring in like philosophy and French, where I literally went and lived in a like attic in Paris and wanted to be a French intellectual. Like that was my kind of thing, and my all of my early literary heroes were like French intellectuals. So, like I love that actually, you know, I love that there are so many different kinds of ways of thinking about data, and there are so many different cool people doing interesting things and approaching data in different ways. I love that the thing that I work on is actually so consequential to better decision making, to solving real world problems, to understanding and evaluating forces in our world. Like, I just love that I'm I'm kind of part of an a way of making a difference that has applications in so many settings. So I just, and I also love that, like, and I know I sound like a broken record bringing up cybernetic
Mhm.
concepts, but like cybernetics would say things are changing all the time and they are evolving. And, like, I love that particularly in my field, which is quite often digital born data, data being used as part of automated systems, there's like quite clearly a journey of growth going on right now. And we are learning to be more responsible in our data practices, and you can see culture shifts occurring, and you can see that some of those shifts will result in dead ends, but from that we will like figure out why those were dead ends and move on to something better. Like the world is changing. So yeah, I just love both that it's dynamic, it's a fascinating group of people facing lots of different kinds of problems, but I also love that, you know, nobody's here saying I've solved all the problems and here you go, like data is neutral, no questions, let's just get on with it. um yeah, it gives me hope.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much. That was a great conversation. I can see myself having to go back and take notes and think more about all of the things that you said. Thanks so much for being here.
It was my pleasure. I love chatting to you about these things.
Thanks for listening to Make Me Data Literate. You can support the work of the Australian Data Science Education Institute at givenow.com.au/ADSEI. Tune in next time for more conversations with amazing data experts.